Hello, everyone. Welcome to my channel. Sit back, dive into our story about how American prostitutes lived, and drift off to sleep in peace. Before the word prostitute was stamped onto a woman's identity, there was a life, often a short one, frequently a hard one, and almost always shaped by forces far beyond her control. In 19th century America, the majority of women who entered prostitution did not do so as a matter of free choice. They were daughters of destitute immigrant families crowded into the tenements of New York, Boston, and Chicago. They were widows left without income in a country that offered women almost no legal employment. They were young girls who had been seduced, deceived, or coerced by men, promised marriage, and delivered ruin. They were the daughters of formerly enslaved people, gating a post-Civil War art that offered black women almost no protection whatsoever from exploitation. Economic landscape of the era was brutal for women without husbands or fathers. Factory work paid it as little as $3 a week, barely enough to pay for a cold room and a loaf of bread. Domestic service offered marginally more stability, but came with its own dangers, including sexual harassment from employers. In this context, prostitution, for many women, was not the bottom of the ladder. It was simply a different rung. Chapter 2: The Houses, the Streets, and the Cribs. American prostitution in the 19th and early 20th centuries was not a single monolithic experience. It existed on a sharply stratified hierarchy, and where a woman stood on that hierarchy determined nearly everything about how she lived, how she aged, and how she died. At the very top were the parlor houses, grand, sleek establishments run by Adams, who cultivated reputations for elegance, discretion, and selective clientele. Cities, New Orleans, San Francisco, and New York harbored houses that were, by contemporary accounts, furnished with genuine luxury. Silk, fine china, live piano music in the parlor. The women who worked in these establishments were often well-dressed, sometimes well-read, and in rare cases wielded a degree of social and economic power that astonished reformers who expected to find only victims. Famous madams like Josie Arlington in New Orleans and Mary Ann Hall in Washington, D.C., accumulated real estate holdings and maintained connections to some of the most powerful men in their cities. Below the parlor houses came the brethrens, more numerous, less refined, far more common across American cities. These were ordinary houses on ordinary streets, sometimes identifiable only by a red lamp in the window, a custom that gave rise to the enduring phrase, red light district. Women in these establishments lived and worked on the premises, rarely leaving, often paying the madam for room, board, clothing, and cosmetics at rates that ensured they were perpetually. At the bottom of the hierarchy were the street prostitutes and the women of the cribs. Tiny, cell-like rooms, very large enough for a cot, that lined the back alleys of districts like San Francisco's Barbary Coast and New Orleans' Storyville. For women here, life was measured in transactions, and the transactions were fast, cheap, and dangerous. Chapter 3. The daily architecture of survival. For the majority of women in prostitution, daily life was structured around a set of relentless economic and social pressures that left little room anything that resembled autonomy. A woman in a mid-range brothel might rise in the late morning, spend the afternoon receiving clients, and whatever remained was hers. In practice, the accounting was often manipulated in the madam's favor. Alcohol was a constant presence. Many establishments required women to encourage clients to purchase drinks, from which the house took a percentage. Alcoholism became epidemic in prostitution districts, a fact the contemporaries noted with it the mixture of mora of condemnation and occasional sympathy. Venereal disease was the other defining feature of life in commercial sex. Syphilis and gonorrhea moved through prostitution districts with devastating speed. Before the advent of antibiotics in the mid-20th century, syphilis was a slow, disfiguring, and ultimately fatal disease. Some establishments attempted rudimentary health inspections. Most did not. Women who became visibly ill were discharged, cast out onto the streets at the moment of their greatest vulnerability. Violence was ordinary, not exceptional. Women were beaten by clients, extorted by police officers, and exploited by the very men who positioned themselves as their protectors. The bully or souteneur, what later generations would call a pimp, was a common figure in urban prostitution districts. A man who offered protection in exchange for a percentage of earnings and who enforced that arrangement through intimidation and physical force. Chapter 4. The Geography of Desire. Storyville, still, and the dist among the most intensely documented prostitution districts in American history in America was Storyville, the legally designated red light district of New Orleans, which operated 890-77 to 910-17. Created city ordinance in an attempt to contain and regulate commercial sex. Storyville, in the words of contemporary observers, a city within a city. It published its own guidebook, the Blue Books, which listed the names, addresses, and sometimes the physical descriptions of women available for hire. Jazz music, which was finding its earliest form in exactly these years, echoed through the district's establishments. Figures who would later become legends of American music. Jelly Roll Morton, Louis Armstrong's early influences, played in the brothels and dance halls of Storyville, lending the district a cultural vitality that complicates any simple narrative of pure degradation. And yet, the daily reality for most women in Storyville was one of confinement and debt. The women who populated the district ranged from those in the grand houses on Basin Street and catering to wealthy white clientele, to the black and Creole women confined by law and custom separate establishments in the back streets. The racial geography of Storyville the racial geography of the South itself. Stratified, rigid, and enforced by both law and violence. When the United States Navy, concerned about the proximity of vice to its training facilities, prodded the city to close Storyville in 1917, the women of the district did not disappear. They scattered into the broader city, trading relative visibility of a designated district for the more dangerous invisibility of unregulated street prostitution. Chapter 5 of The Reformers and the Redeemed and the Progressive Era of the late 19th and early 20th centuries brought with it an extraordinary wave of moral reform, and no subject attracted more reformist energy than prostitution. Social purity organizations, women's suffrage groups, and religious missions converged on red light districts across the country, armed with Bibles, survey questionnaires, and an unshakable conviction that the women they encountered were fundamentally victims in need of rescue. The Salvation Army established rescue homes. The Young Women's Christian Association operated boarding houses designed to give women an alternative to the brothel. Settlement house workers like Jane Addams documented the conditions of urban vice with sociological precision. The reformers produced an enormous literature, pamphlets, exposé, government, and reports, and novels that had the paradoxical effect of making prostitution more visible and more condemned simultaneously. The Mann Act of 1910, also known as the White Slave Track Act, made it a federal crime to transport women across state lines for immoral purposes. The law was ostensibly aimed at preventing coerced trafficking, but in practice it was applied broadly and often selectively, used to prosecute black men in interracial relationships, and to criminalize consensual activity alongside coerced traffic. The women themselves occupied an ambiguous position in the reform imagination. Reformers tended to see them as innocent victims of male lust and economic desperation, a framing that was often accurate, that also denied women in any complexity or agency. The occasional woman who stated plainly that she had chosen her profession over domestic service, who expressed indifference to rescue, troubled the reformers deeply because she did not fit the narrative they required. Chapter 6. Race, Class, and the unique ledger, the history of American prostitution, is inseparable from the history of American racial hierarchy. Black women occupied the most precarious and dangerous position in the sexual economy, subject not only to the general vulnerabilities of the profession, but to the additional violence of a society that had historically treated black women's bodies as available for use without consent. During slavery, the sexual exploitation of enslaved women by white men was not prostitution, it was rape, legitimized by law and custom. In the aftermath of emancipation, black women who entered prostitution did so into a market that paid them less, offered them fewer legal protections, and subjected them to greater police violence than their white counterparts. In cities across the South, black were confined to the least desirable sections of segregated vice districts. In northern cities, racial zoning was less formal but no less real. Chinese immigrant women occupied a similarly marginalized position on the West Coast. Beginning in the 1850s and accelerating through the 1870s and 1880s, Chinese women, many of them brought to the United States under conditions of near slavery by trafficking networks, worked in the brothels and cribs of San Francisco's Chinatown. The Page Act of 1775, ostensibly targeting the importation of women for immoral purposes, in practice operated as a racially targeted restriction on Chinese female immigration, further isolating the women already present and making it nearly impossible for others to enter legitimately. The Presbyterian Mission Home in San Francisco, led for decades by Donald Dina Cameron, rescued hundreds of Chinese women from these conditions. A genuine humanitarian effort that was nonetheless complicated by the paternalism and cultural assumptions of its founders. Chapter 7: The Women Wo Left and the Women Wo Do Didn't. Not all women who entered prostitution remained in it. Contemporary studies, including those conducted by social workers in the Progressive Era, documented significant movement in and out of the profession. Women left prostitution for marriage, sometimes to clients, sometimes to men who knew nothing of their past. They left for factory work when wages rose sufficiently. They left when they saved enough money, which was rare but not impossible, particularly for women who managed to operate with some degree of independence rather than under the control of a madam or a procurer. The women who remained were not uniformly those who could not leave. Some stayed because the alternatives were genuinely worse. A 12-hour shift in a garment factory for wages that not cover rent was, for some women, a less attractive option than irregular, potentially higher earnings of prostitution. Others stayed because as addiction to alcohol or later to opiates made departure functionally Others stayed because they had been in the life long enough that reintegration into respectable society seemed both practically and psychologically beyond reach. The reformers' rescue homes offered escape, but they also imposed conditions: mandatory religious instruction, surveillance, domestic labor, that many women found intolerable. The ledger of those who were saved by the rescue missions was never as full as the organization's annual reports suggested. Women who aged out of the profession without resources faced a bleak landscape. Older women in prostitution districts frequently ended their lives in poverty, public hospitals, or in the almshouses that American cities maintained for their most destitute residents. Chapter 8: The Long Shadow. From Vice Commissions to the 20th Century. By the second decade of the 20th century, the combined pressure of moral reform, public health concerns, and wartime mobilization had produced a dramatic transformation of American prostitution. Between 1910 and 1920, nearly every major American city closed its officially tolerated red light district. fell in 1917. San Francisco's Barbary Coast was shuttered. The Livy district of Chicago was shuttered as well. The closure of these districts did not end institution. It dispersed it. Women moved from visible, geographically concentrated areas into hotels, rooming houses, and private apartments, becoming at once less viable to reformers and more vulnerable to police harassment and exploitation. The 20th century brought new forms and new contexts to commercial sin America. But the fundamental conditions that produced it: economic inequality, limited options for women without male support, the persistent demand, male clients, did not disappear with the closure of Storyville's gates. The women who had lived in those districts carried their histories with them into the uncertain terrain of the modern city, navigating a society that had simultaneously declared itself horrified by their existence and continued to generate the conditions that made their existence inevitable. Their lives, ordinary and extraordinary, constrained and occasionally defiantly self-constructed, remain one of the most complex and inadequately understood chapters in the social history of the United States.